King David of Scotland was a central figure in the development of the Scottish kingdom, as during his reign, Scotland experienced changes to its political, administration, military, and the development of monastic institutions. David was born in the year 1084 to Malcolm III and St. Margaret of Scotland. But, looking at the line of succession, David was far down on the list, as he was the youngest son of 8 boys, but still a prince. Yet, by the time David was 9 or 10, both his parents had died. His father was killed at the Battle of Alnwick, along with one of his brothers, Edward, who was Malcolm's designated heir, and his mother is said to have died of grief a few days after the battle in ill health. A succession crisis soon developed, and civil war broke out between Malcolm's remaining sons and their uncle, Donald. An account in the 14th century tells us that David and his siblings were immediately besieged at Edinburgh Castle by Donald's troops, but the accounts at the time of Margaret's death mention no siege. One of our sources, the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, tells us that the Scots chose Donald as their king and then drove out all the English who had been granted settlement in King Malcolm's court. King Malcolm had given refuge to many English exiles who had fled England after the Norman conquest, most notably Edgar Atheling, a claimant to the English throne, as he was descendant from the house of the Wessex dynasty. Clearing of the old regime normally meant also removing any political allies, which the English exiles were certainly a part of. When the news reached the Anglo-Norman court in England, the commander of the English at the Battle of Alnwick, Robert de Mowbray, was rewarded as stated in the history of the English states. When the news was heard, the king summoned the earl, bidding him come to court, and saying that he would hear his words, and according to what he should hear, would be well rewarded for doing right. King Malcolm had led several raids into England during his reign. By the time David's uncle Donald was consolidating his control on the Scottish throne, David was in exile at the Anglo-Norman court in England, along with his brothers in 1094. The King of England at this time was William II, or William Rufus. A rather peculiar set of affairs for David to be in the kingdom which Fawcett had slain his father and brother. But for King William, treating the surviving sons of King Malcolm well would suit his plans for Scotland, as he had a man in the waiting who was a legitimate heir to the Scottish throne, Duncan, another son of King Malcolm by his first wife. Duncan had spent his time as a hostage of the Normans, as agreed by King Malcolm and King William the Conqueror as a term of the Treaty of Abernethy in 1072. Duncan was raised within Norman society and was accustomed to the Norman culture, even being knighted by King William, so a loyal sworn man on the throne of the Kingdom of Scotland would be perfect for the English king. The book David I, the King Who Made Scotland by Richard Oram states that when Duncan went to William Rufus, offered him his military service in return for a grant of his father's kingdom, and swore fealty to the English king when he bestowed Scotland on him, Duncan began to raise troops from the levies of the Norman nobility, and in return they would be promised lands and titles as they had when Duke William conquered England. After all, Duncan had Norman allies to call upon. As for David, he was too young to accompany his half-brother back to Scotland. With the support of the Normans, Duncan defeated his uncle in 1094. Donald then fled the kingdom. Duncan was now crowned King of Scots, but only ruled for 6 months. A combination of his political followers being foreign as well as himself being seen as a foreigner, the Scots rose up in revolt over the new king's allies, which Duncan was forced to relinquish. But with his power base now weakened, his uncle Donald returned, and Duncan died in a later battle. Donald's remaining reign was short, as he was an elderly man with no heirs, and there were still plenty of sons by Malcolm III to either fight their uncle or try to appease him and work towards becoming heir by diplomacy. One son, Edmund, did try this, but by 1097, Donald was defeated again by a force led by Edgar Atheling, the son's uncle by their mother Margaret. This time Donald did not escape, and Edmund was sent to a monastery. One source, the Chronicles of Melrose, states, "In the year 1097, King William sent Edgar Atheling into Scotland with an army to drive out Donald and establish King Malcolm's son Edgar as king, and this he also did." Edgar was now King of Scots. It's most likely David did aid his brother in some capacity, but we have no information on what role he played. William of Malmesbury mentions that Donald was slain by the craftiness of his youngest nephew David. By the time of his older brother's reign, David was a teenager, but as he had two older brothers still alive, his options in Scotland were limited. Even in England, there was not much prospect for the young prince, as the English king was satisfied with the situation in Scotland. The northern borders of England were secure thanks to having a loyal man on the Scottish throne, so William's interests were elsewhere. But situations can change rapidly in the medieval world. All it takes is the death of someone, like a king for example. On the 2nd of August 1100, King William Rufus was killed in either a hunting accident or an assassination in the New Forest. With his death, a new king ascended to the throne, King Henry I, younger brother to William. And after 4 months on the throne, Henry managed to secure a marriage with Matilda of Scotland, Malcolm III's daughter. The marriage was a political move for Henry, and he needed to shore up his popularity and to secure a solid dynasty by marrying Matilda. He was uniting his Norman line with that of a member of the House of Wessex, as well as the House of Dunkeld in Scotland. For David, this granted new opportunities for him. He was able to immerse himself in the Anglo-Norman court culture and perhaps learn from them. After all, the Normans had been successful in England, so why not learn all and use that knowledge to one's advantage? After all, David was now the brother-in-law to the King of England, and just like his brother Duncan before him, David was being taught to live and fight as a Norman. William of Malmesbury states on David's development, "Rubbed off all tarnish of Scottish barbarity through being polished by intercourse and friendship with us." As David was now allowed access in the innermost circle of the court, he would have seen how the administration was run, which in England at this time was a well-oiled machine. By the year 1107, David had spent most of his life now in England, but in the same year his brother Edgar died. His death is recorded in the Annals of Ulster and the Chronicles of Melrose, which states, "In the year 1107, Edgar, the King of the Scots, died on the 6th day before the Ides of January, and his brother Alexander succeeded him." With Edgar's death, David's fortunes again changed, as in Edgar's will an agreement was made that David would receive lands in the south of Scotland. Yet the new king, Alexander, may have been hesitant to honour such an agreement, and David may have had to rely on King Henry to help obtain his inheritance. And it would be some time before David did gain his new lands, as the only evidence we have of David acting in his new lands is in 1113, when Selkirk Abbey was formed. We don't have any chronicles detailing David's activity from 1108 to 1113. There are suggestions in the chronicles he was in Scotland, and in another that he was in England. We don't know for sure where he was or what he was doing. His patron, King Henry, had taken control of Normandy from his brother in 1106 after the Battle of Tinchebray, and would spend the next few years trying to maintain Normandy. So it's unlikely King Henry would personally help David, but there is no firm evidence in the chronicles that give us a definitive answer. By 1113, David was in a considerably more powerful position. David was now a powerful landowner, now that his inheritance was begrudgingly recognised by his brother, although not obtained through warfare, but certainly using the suggestion of violence. David also managed to secure a marriage to Matilda de Celis, a widow and the Countess of Huntingdon and Northampton. David sought the permission of King Henry and David's sister, the Queen Margaret, who were supporting his bid for the marriage. King Henry agreed and allowed the marriage. David's rapid rise to power in Scotland and England was not well met by everyone. There is a poem from the time period that reads, "It's bad what Malcolm's son has done. Dividing us from Alexander, he causes, like each king's sons before, the plunder of stable Alba." Like his elder brother Duncan, the Gaelic elite were not happy that David, who was also incorporated into the Anglo-Norman culture, which they saw as foreign, now held significant power and land in Scotland, and was now known as the Prince of the Cumbrians and Earl of Huntingdon. David also now had lands in the Midlands of England. During 1114, we have records showing David in attendance to charters being issued, but not much else for the next years of David's life. His sister, the Queen Matilda, died in 1118. We can only speculate on David's reaction to his sister's death. We have no records of him being at the Anglo-Norman court around his sister's death, nor her funeral. As his sister was the closest thing to a motherly figure since David's mother, and is responsible for the position he was now in, David must have been grief-stricken. The Chronicles of Melrose simply states, "Matilda, Queen of the English, died." David and King Henry's relationship can be summarised as protege and mentor, as David was King Henry's sworn right-hand man. After all, David held the borders of Scotland, and because of this, the borders were laxed and not so heavily fortified, apart from at Carlisle, which would later cause issues between David and Henry. As in 1122, Henry visited Carlisle and began works on fortifying the city after receiving it from his vassal, Ranulph. But also in the same year, Henry's illegitimate daughter, Sibella, died. She was the wife of Alexander, King of Scots. Sibella and Alexander had no children. Alexander did have a bastard son, but the Scots' rules of inheritance were not the same as the primogeniture ones in England, meaning David would be king if his brother died. But the laws of primogeniture would give Henry grief in Normandy, as his brother's son, William, had sparked an uprising with some backing of the Norman elites. Henry headed for Normandy to quell this uprising, and David may have joined him as a sworn man to fight and lead in the royal army, which defeated the rebels by March 1124. But by April, everything would change for David, as his brother Alexander had died. Now the path to kingship was open for David, but he still had to face a few challenges. In part 1, we explored King David's early life, from pauper prince to Prince of the Cumbrians, and now in 1124 the throne of Scotland is vacant, as the Lord Chronicles explains. On the 23rd of April, King Alexander of Scotland passed away, and David, his brother, who was Earl of Northamptonshire, succeeded to the kingdom and held them both together, the Kingdom of Scotland and the Earldom in England. This text implies a smooth transition of power between the two brothers. However, this may not have been the case, as there were others who could claim the Scottish throne. As mentioned before, the laws of primogeniture were not apparent in Scotland yet. The first claimant is William Fitz-Duncan, the son of David's older half-brother, Duncan II, who by all accounts could pose a serious challenge to David, as William is described as an able warrior and commander, and would later lead Scottish armies on behalf of his uncle. We don't know the exact reason why William never mounted a challenge. David Oram states, "The answer is probably that David and his supporters brought off William with a bargain that must have appeared to satisfy his ambitions." William may have been aware that challenging his uncle would prove incredibly difficult, especially with the support of the English king, and the potential deal being offered was enough for him, and he would potentially become Tarnister, meaning heir over David's young son, Henry. The second challenge to the throne came shortly after King David's coronation in Scone. Only Orderic Vitalis mentions Malcolm Mac Alexander, the illegitimate son of Alexander I. No other source mentions Malcolm's uprising against King David. Orderic tells us from Normandy, affected to snatch the kingdom from David, and fought against him 2 sufficiently fierce battles. But David, who was loftier in understanding and in power and wealth, conquered him and his followers. Despite the defeat, Malcolm was not killed or captured, but instead fled to parts of Scotland not under complete jurisdiction by King David. Malcolm would become a thorn in King David's side in the next decade. With the dynastic problems over for now, King David could now focus on statesmanship and issuing charters. King David's reign also has a unique title of this period in Scotland, called the Davidian Revolution. The term is coined from the extensive changes and developments in Scotland during King David's reign, ranging from the development of monastic institutions such as Selkirk Abbey and the creation of burghs, a self-governing town with a degree of autonomy. The first ever borough in Scotland was Berwick-upon-Tweed, or South Berwick, granted by King David in 1130. Another aspect of the revolution was bringing in Norman lords into Scotland, the most famous family being the de Bruce family, who King David granted the lordship of Annandale to Robert de Bruce in 1124. The Davidian Revolution was bringing in European styles of government and administration to Scotland. For example, the swearing ceremony of lords to their land liege via Scottish feudalism, the creation of royal burghs. The military of Scotland would see King David having access to elite heavy Norman cavalry, thus strengthening his control on the kingdom, and they would play a part in future conflicts. The piety of David's mother and sister would play a part in his development of religious buildings, as stated in the Chronicle of Melrose. In the year 1128, the Church of the Holy Rood at Edinburgh began to be founded. In the same year, the Church of Kelso was founded. The first charter King David issued granted land to Robert de Bruce. What's interesting about this first charter is that the witnesses present, none of them were from the Gallic elite, apart from King David. The charter addresses King David's French and English subjects. And considering King David's background and upbringing in England was immersed in the Anglo-Norman culture, and King David's half-brother Duncan was seen as a hostile foreign figure in Scotland and only ruled for 6 months, King David would aim to avoid the same fate. So not by involving his Scottish subjects, he was avoiding displeasing them, while strengthening his power by bringing in new loyal men whom he knew he could trust. By 1126, King David felt comfortable leaving Scotland for a time, as the Anglo-Saxon chronicles tells us. Then, after Michaelmas, came David, the King of the Scots, from Scotland to this country, and King Henry received him with great ceremony, and he remained the whole year in this country. King David visited England for a few reasons. One of them was an ecclesiastical matter regarding the bishopric of York seeking jurisdiction over Scottish ones. The second issue was the succession of the throne of England. King Henry's only son and heir had died in 1120 in the White Ship disaster, and despite remarrying, Henry and his wife Adeliza had no children. The only legitimate heir King Henry had left was his daughter, Empress Matilda, King David's niece. To try and secure a smooth transition of power, King Henry had ordered that his subjects swore oaths of loyalty to support the Empress if King Henry died without producing a male heir. This was an excellent opportunity for King David to secure some political leverage to use in the future. As King David was one of the most powerful men in both England and Scotland, and given his close friendship with King Henry, King David swore the oath to the Empress first. With the swearing ceremony over, King David could now focus on the church affairs affecting his kingdom. The issue was that the Archbishop of York, Thurstan, sought to have authority over the Scottish bishops. Thurstan even tried to venture to Rome to speak with the Pope himself, but was convinced to only send messages by King Henry, returning the favour for King David's support. A truce was now in place for the religious matters. For the next few months, religious matters would dominate King David's attention. The first abbot of Dunfermline was anointed, and Selkirk Abbey was moved to Kelso. Before we continue, it's important to mention the political landscape of Scotland and the physical borders in the High Middle Ages. Richard Oram's David I, the king who made Scotland, explains the situation perfectly. For most of the 10th and 11th centuries, the kings of Scots had exercised a fluctuating measure of control over the northern regions of the mainland beyond the mountain barriers of the Month. The control of most of the isles around Scotland were also not under Scottish jurisdiction. The isles had influence from Irish, Scotty and Viking, but during King David's reign, the isle was called the Kingdom of the Isles and were ruled by Olofur Garodason, another protege of King Henry. King David's father had campaigned to bring more of northern Scotland into the kingdom, which at the time had various petty kingdoms, and each submitted to King Malcolm, but under what terms we don't know. But whatever the terms were, they held at least until 1130. By 1130, King David was back in England to act as a judge in a trial in which a nobleman was accused of treachery. After the trial's conclusion, King David spent the spring in England attending to the business of his English lands. The year would mark a tremendous tragedy for King David as his wife Queen Maud died. Unfortunately, we have little to no information on the last few years of Queen Maud's life. Even her burial site is disputable. King David's love for his wife was profoundly deep, that he never remarried. But trouble was on the horizon for King David. The ruler of Moray, Angus, and Malcolm mac Alexander had joined forces and invaded. The kingdom of Moray had been one of the northern sub-kingdoms dominated by King David's father. Whether the timing was a coincidence of Queen Maud's death, we don't know, but the event was a major one as it's mentioned in several chronicles. Annals of Ulster, Annals of Inzenfallen, Chronicle of Malrose and Orderic Vitalis all record the uprising and the subsequent battle. Both Angus and Malcolm had claims to the Scottish throne, although Angus would have been the one to be placed on the throne if they succeeded. Yet King David was still in England, so the defence of the realm fell to Edward, a cousin of King David. The rebel army travelled from Moray down to Stracathro, where they were engaged by the Royal Scottish Army. Only one source states the number of men of Moray, some 5,000 strong according to Vitalis, and some 10,000 Scots. The battle was hard fought as both sides suffered casualties. The Scots lost 1,000 men, whereas the men of Moray lost 4,000 including their king. The Scots' losses were attributed to a counterattack possibly led by Malcolm, who once again escaped. With this defeat, Moray was subdued and later the lands were given to King David's half-nephew, William Fitz-Duncan, after a period of subjugation. Malcolm would later be captured in 1134 and spent the rest of his life as a prisoner in Roxburgh Castle. With no major uprising since 1130, King David continued with the development and consecration of new churches. King David would continue his revolution by gifting in return for vassalage the new lands that had been subjugated, although this would take time and manpower. King David would give land as colonies to Anglo-Norman lords and also to a Flemish mercenary who was given land in Duffus in northern Scotland and would later build Duffus Castle, originally as a wooden motte and bailey. King David's plan of a centralised kingdom was bearing fruit, and by 1135 another opportunity to expand his power and influence came. On the 1st of December 1135, King Henry I of England died. The man who enabled King David to have all he had now was dead, and the English king's plan of succession was unravelled in the space of a few weeks. Now there was a new king on the throne, King Stephen, but his support in England wasn't universal. As he took an opportunic risk to take the throne, his actions would kick off a period in England called the Anarchy. So, if we examine the relationship between King David and King Henry, and then look at the same with King Stephen, we can see a different attitude from King David for the early years of King Stephen's reign. King David would be the biggest threat, as he could easily invade the north of England and cause all sorts of chaos. As King David had already captured Carlisle and Newcastle in quick succession, the two would meet at Durham, but no fighting occurred, and King David obtained the territories he wanted for him and his son Henry, who pledged fealty to King Stephen as an English earl. The peace did not last for long. In the spring of 1137, King David demanded more land that he stated belonged to him, and despite a peace envoy, King David invaded and fought at the Battle of the Standard, and despite the defeat, King David managed to negotiate a settlement that benefited him greatly. The Scottish territorial claims of Cumberland and Northumberland were recognised. For the next 2 years, King David was dealing with the matters of church and state, as during the 1130s there was an anti-pope which created a schism in the Catholic Church, creating arguments over bishops running which diocese, and to support the claims of each bishop, the Scots had sided with the anti-pope Anacletus, as he agreed with the Scots' terms, as during this time Scottish monarchs were not crowned as kings, but rather they would sit on a ceremonial stone called the Stone of Destiny, along with a few more rituals involving recanting the genealogy of kings. Yet King David wanted to be crowned by an archbishop, similar to England's crowning ceremony, but at the same time King David wanted the Scottish Church to be free of influence by the English bishops, namely the Bishop of York. But by 1138 the anti-pope was dead, and King David had no choice but to submit to whatever judgment the Pope brought. Yet King David and his bishops managed to linger the arguments and the negotiations long enough for the Archbishop of York to expire in 1140. The political power of the Yorkish bishopric would be reduced for many years. As the anarchy raged on in England, and King Stephen's terrible diplomacy with the church, King David could take the advantage, attacking York in 1149, but the garrison of York managed to push the Scottish forces back. The issue over the Scottish church subjugation would linger even after King David's death. By 1140, King David was firmly in control of Carlisle, and his son, the Prince Henry, was Earl of Huntingdon as an English vassal. For King David, the benefit of having good chunks of the north of England under his domain provided not only territorial power, but a financial boost, as the silver mines at Ulston provided substantial revenue. One way a medieval monarch could project their power and prestige is to have good quality coinage made. With the silver from the mines, King David began to mint coins and had them distributed across Scotland. By 1149, King David was at the height of his power. Parts of England were firmly his: Cumbria, Lancaster and Northumberland, and most of mainland Scotland was certainly under a more centralised government than it had ever been before. King David also managed his relationship with the Gallic elite far better than any of his brothers before him. The Kingdom of Scotland had certainly changed over the reign of King David, and by 1150 the king was an old man, preparing for the next generation to take over. His nephew, William Fitz-Duncan, had died in 1147, and King David's son was an able man with plenty of experience to rule. Yet structured plans can flip like a coin in the medieval world, and by 1152 Prince Henry had died after a long illness, throwing King David's plan of a secure succession up in the air. He was now experiencing what his friend and tutor, King Henry, felt some 32 years earlier, and had to scramble a quick succession plan. Luckily for King David, he had grandsons who could inherit the throne, but they were still too young to rule. To prevent any distant or close relative from seizing the throne, as had happened in England, King David appointed a regent who he knew he could trust, the Earl of Fife. King David then ordered the young Prince Malcolm to tour Scotland in an act to show the legitimate successor, and to secure the earldom of Northumbria, he went with his second grandson, William, to Newcastle to again show the legitimate heir to the earldom, and to double shore up the succession, King David took hostages. By 1153, King David knew his end was coming, and he sought to enter God's peace. The Chronicle of Melrose summarises King David's reign. David was king in Scotland for 29 years, warily discerning what was provident. After he had fortified the kingdom with castles and arms, the king is said to have died an old man at Carlisle.